Thank you, Christoph, for such a warm welcome. And they told me that Churchill spoke from this podium, so I guess everything is downhill from me from now on, okay? So it's a great privilege and a great honor to be here with you. As Christopher said, my great-grandfather emigrated from Appenzell to Argentina. Apparently, they promised him some land in Argentina, and when he got there, the government defaulted on the promise. But anyway, so you see, we were already doing kind of bad things then. He decided to stay, but I have to say the truth. I'm only 25% Swiss because it's the family of the father of my father. That's where I get my name from. I'm 50% Italian. I'm 25% Spanish. So I'm 100% Argentinian. Okay. Yes, it's true at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was like a magnet for immigration from Europe. It was a country of promise. It became one of the richest countries in the world. Yet in the 10 years prior to Milei becoming president, 2 million Argentines left the country. Imagine that we're a country of 47 million, so 2 million people leaving the country is an exodus of around 5% of the population. And the people that left the country were the young, were the sons and daughters of the rich, were the sons and daughters of the middle class, were the sons and daughters of the poor. And I think that the exodus after 15 years without growth, after 40 years of relatively dismal growth performance, when I was born in 1966, Argentina was a country which was richer than Spain. I was 10 years old and Argentina was still a country which was richer than Spain. Today, our income doesn't even closely compare to that of Spain. So the tragedy of Argentina, I've seen it fold myself over my lifetime. And we realized that if something drastic did not happen in our country, we were going to age watching our kids and watching our grandchildren over Zoom because they would leave. And I think the sense of desperation of what had happened in the country is what motivated people to vote for someone so radical, for someone so different as Javier Milei. Imagine that for Argentines for 50 years have heard the story that the state was going to solve all their problems. Christopher basically referred to this. And Javier Milei comes here to tell the Argentines that the government is the source of all their problems. So you can imagine that it's a discourse which is exactly 180 degrees in the different direction. But yet the Argentines embrace the ideas of freedom, embrace this change, because we saw that what we were doing before was not working for us, and it was not working for our families. So what I decided to do in this presentation is that Javier Milei have implemented a very bold reform program, a reform program of the state, a reform program of regulation. It was not something which was improvised. We started working in preparation for this 2 years before he became president. So my lecture today is going to be more about the methodology. Imagine that you have a country. You say, I want to reform structurally this country. I want to reform profoundly this country. How do you go about doing that? So what I want to do is to share the experience of how we kind of build this reform program. I think from a methodological point of view is kind of interesting. So we're going to discuss the preparation phase, the execution phase, the resistance to the reform program and the results. So we're going to go over those phases. But I may start by saying that this structure that Christopher described that starts in the mid-40s with Perón, I call it a status quo situation. I mean, Argentina is a country with a status quo bias. There are very strong interests. Christopher mentioned the unions. There's part of our business community, not all, of course, which kind of have gotten accustomed of getting subsidies from the government for fencing off competition, from reducing, from closing the economy to the world. So, and then it has basically also a political establishment which protects this kind of structure. And I came to realize that this status quo bias was built and was sustained by a legal architecture. It's the legal architecture which cemented this economic structure where these privileges that certain groups obtained from the rest of the population were basically established in the law. And I came to the conclusion that in order to change this system for good, we had to blast this legal architecture for good.
Hallo, mein Name ist René Scheu. Ich bin Geschäftsführer des Instituts für Schweizer Wirtschaftspolitik an der Universität Luzern. Ich habe 25 Sekunden, um Sie zu überzeugen. Das IWP ist ein Wirtschaftsforschungsinstitut, an dem 20 Postdocs, Doktoranden und studentische Hilfskräfte arbeiten. Wir finanzieren uns über freiwillige Spenden. Wissen Sie, wie Sie Teil der IWP-Community werden können? Ganz einfach. Folgen Sie dem pochenden Herzen auf unserer Website oder auf unserer App. Unterstützen Sie uns, unterstützen Sie unsere wertvolle Arbeit. Und nun weiterhin viel Spaß und Erkenntnisgewinn mit dem Video Film ab.
So I'm going to tell you how do you build a project to blast this legal architecture, because let me say something else. We feel that we're in the middle of a revolution, but a very peculiar way of revolution, because we're going to do a revolution without doing a revolution. Because revolution changed the institutional framework. We want to do the revolution within the democratic institutions of Argentina, in which we deeply believe. So, but certainly it's a challenge. Let me give you a little bit of context first, so that you know a little bit what has been happening in Argentina this recent year and a half of Milei's administration. As Christopher said, we inherited a very, very unstable situation. Inflation in December of 23 was 25% monthly. I have to, I'm in a Swiss audience, so I have to clarify this, okay? And inflation was running at 1.5 daily. So we were on the verge of a hyperinflation, which a previous government, which had really run amok with monetary and fiscal policy. And Javier Milei came with one basic idea. Part of the conundrums of Argentina come from having had, for many years, a very large fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit has to be financed with money printing. Money printing is what's going to generate inflation. So he said Argentina is not going to have a fiscal deficit anymore. And we inherited a fiscal deficit of 5% of GDP. And believe it or not, in the first months of his administration, he closed the budget deficit and had a fiscal surplus. So he reduced in his first month's government expenditure by 5% of GDP, thinking out of the box, being very brave, being bold. So from January of 24, we had a fiscal surplus, and we've kept this fiscal surplus throughout the rest of the administration. So here I have a few graphs. Of course, once you reduce the fiscal deficit, you don't have to print money anymore, so that allows inflation to come down very quickly. You see the upper left graph is the inflation rate, how it came down very significantly. The second graph shows, let me see here, it's output. So you see that we were coming into a recession, but after a few months it bottomed down, and then the economy had a significant recovery. This is kind of interesting. I'm going to speak more about this in a minute, but in the first year when Javier Milei did a fiscal adjustment of 5% of GDP, the economy grew 6%. You can see, the upper right graph is public expenditure. That's where you see the big reduction in government expenditure. The lower left is the deficit. You see how we move very quickly from a deficit situation to a fiscal surplus. And the most perhaps amazing graph is this one that I have here behind me, which is the poverty rate. Because when you actually reduce the government expenditure, which basically we have a metaphor for that, it's the chainsaw, okay? What is the chainsaw? With the chainsaw, you cut this useless government expenditure. The first thing that we managed to do is to reduce money printing, reduction in money printing, reduce inflation. Inflation is a tax on the poor. So this fiscal adjustment allows us to reduce the poverty rates dramatically. So we lifted 12 million people out of poverty in the first year and a half of Javier Milei as a result of the fiscal adjustment. Okay? So anyway, I think that there are two main ideas. Of course, Milei has a very strong international agenda, very aligned with the US and with Israel. He has a security agenda as well. I'm not going to deal into that because I'm going to focus more on the economic issues. In the economic issues, he has two big themes and two big ideas. One is this one that I was already mentioning about fiscal surplus, and the other is what I would call deregulation. Javier Milei would call it economic freedom, this quest to transform Argentina into the freest country in the world. So I think what I just mentioned, which is this 5% of GDP adjustment in government expenditure in 1 month, which is a reduction of 30% in government expenditure in 1 month. I mean, Christopher said we cut transfers to the provinces, we cut public works, we cut public sector wages, we got rid of public employees, I must add, without any effect on the provision of public sector services, because you had thousands of people which were getting a paycheck and they were not even coming to work, so you cut all that thing. As I said, it basically challenges our view on fiscal policy in terms of how fast you can do a fiscal adjustment and how deep that adjustment can be. I think it's what Javier did is pretty much quite exceptional. If you look at all the fiscal adjustments since 1946, there are only 24 cases in which countries adjusted government expenditure more than 30% in a particular year, but all of them are at the end of wars. For example, the US government expenditure in the US in 1946 fell 30%, but of course World War II had just finished, correct? Out of peacetime, there are no examples of this one of Javier Milei. And so I think that in itself is already quite interesting. The second thing is this idea of challenging the conventional wisdom. Which conventional wisdom? The conventional wisdom that if you do a fiscal adjustment, you're going to have a recession. Probably you would think that someone will tell you, look, if you adjust 5% of GDP government expenditure, the economy is going. And we said, no. It's actually the opposite, because each peso that we spend is a peso that we have to tax people to pay for that money. I mean, the government can't buy things out of thin air. So you may be charging a taxes or you may be printing money, but if you print money, you have the inflation tax. So one way or the other, people are paying for the expenditure. So when you reduce the government expenditure, you reduce one by one the taxes that you charge people. So it's true the government is going to spend less, but the people are going to spend more because they're going to be less taxed. So it's a crowding in effect. And in fact, for me, this was not pretty weird because there are two very famous Italian economists, Francesco Giavazzi and Alberto Alesina. I don't know if the name rings a bell. Probably if there are economic students here, they will know about this. They had studied fiscal adjustment programs in Europe. And they had found you can always do a fiscal adjustment two ways. No? You can reduce government expenditure or you can increase taxes. And what they found is that the adjustments that were implemented through reduction of government expenditure were expansionary. Because when you reduce government expenditure, you free these resources for the private sector. The private sector uses, first of all, it spends the money more wisely, no? Because Javier Milei always says, we had a system where the politician said, give me your money, I'll spend it for you. But don't worry, it's going to be good for you, okay? So just relax, okay? And Javier Milei says, I don't want to do that. I want to give people's money to them, which it's their money to start with, and have them choose how they're going to spend it. And so Francesco Giavazzi and Alberto Alesina had found that if you do reduction in government expenditure, you don't have any effect on output. I think that is another challenge to conventional wisdom, which is worth kind of underscoring, and I think it's an interesting thing to watch. I was going to say it's an interesting lesson, but an Argentine talking about economics, we cannot lecture anybody on anything. So I'm just going to describe the things that we're doing here, okay? And then I think there was a third dimension in which this fiscal adjustment is interesting. You realize one thing, no? I mentioned fiscal adjustment. It's the adjustment of the fisc. When I adjust the fisc, I release resources for the public. So for the public, the true fiscal adjustment with state spending is high. Because if state spending is high, that means taxes have to be high. So the real adjustment for the private sector is to have a high government, a large government, not a small government. I hope you're following what I'm saying. And but the third thing that I think is interesting to underscore is that people said, well, if you do a 5% fiscal adjustment, well, I mean, maybe you can do it, the size and the speed, oh, maybe it doesn't have an effect on output, but for sure you're going to have a political cost of doing a 5%. And I tell you, people love it. People love it because people were waiting in Argentina to find a politician that was willing to cap the crap in which the government was spending people's money and give their money back to them. And the reduction in the poverty rate is the best indicator of that. The government was spending money that it didn't have. It was printing money to finance that. It was taxing the poor. When the government stops spending that money, then it's giving that money back to the poor principally, and that's why the poverty rate falls. So today, for example, if you were to do a poll and you would ask people which is the most nicest thing that they like about the Milei government, of course they're going to say the reduction on the inflation rate, but they're also going to say the chainsaw. Okay, this idea of someone finally came to save us from this bloated government expenditure and give us back our money. So I think that is also interesting because I think there is a conventional wisdom that a reduction in government expenditure would be politically costly, and I think that has to be revisited as a hypothesis. I don't think there's a real reason for that to be the case. Well, so that's as much as I'm going to say about the agenda of his first pillar, which is this fiscal surplus. That I'm going to focus more on the deregulation. And I will start by saying a few things, which is that we believe deregulation is above and beyond everything a pro-growth strategy. Not because of the obvious, no, which is that, of course, if firms are not so cluttered with obligations that they have to do to the state, information, requirements, permits, and things like that, but because the regulation works a little bit like a fixed cost, so it's particularly hurtful for small firms and for entrepreneurs. Imagine it as a fixed cost. So large corporations, they have their compliance lawyers, they have their departments, they can kind of go over the hurdle of all this, but the entrepreneur, it's really kind of very difficult and it's very costly. So, and how does an economy grow? An economy grows through innovation, and so new firms that come, they disrupt the market, they become big, and so regulation is kind of really kind of hitting those type of entrepreneurs. And the other thing, which does not apply to Switzerland at all, but this really applies to Latin America and Argentina, regulation is a perfect source for corruption, because every time you have to do something with the government, then there's a government official on the other side that can profit from your struggle, okay, to get this done, okay? So let me go a little bit. I've kind of talked about this, that the diagnosis that we have in Argentina is that we have the status quo society, they have this architecture, legal architecture, which is supporting the system, and okay, we need to kind of change this legal architecture. So let me get straight into the discussion of how you do that, okay? Well, I'm going to tell you how I did it. And maybe there's a lesson for someone else. I can only say what I did, okay? So I'm going to discuss now the methodology. So the methodology is this. Oh, I have this legal architecture. What is this legal architecture? It's all the laws. Okay, fine, I'm going to review all the laws. Which means I'm going to read all the laws. I'm an economist, but don't worry. You know, I was in Congress. I tell my students that I've never kind of tried those hallucinogenic mushrooms that they sell in Amsterdam. But I've been to the Argentine Congress, so I know the feeling. Okay, you go in there, and the time dimension, the dimension and of time and space gets distorted. Okay, people talk, you don't understand anything, nothing makes sense. Anyway, so I kind of look. There are two things you don't want to know how they're done. Okay, sausages and laws. Okay, so I have no problem. We can go and touch the laws at will, okay? So I now have Argentina, all the laws. How many laws? 4,200 laws. Okay, guys, let's start reading. So we started in May 22. I'm going to basically tell you how we went about reading these laws and changing these laws. And because you can imagine that I don't know about all the subjects, it would be kind of totally kind of ridiculous to pretend that you know about everything. And, okay, so this was the objective. I had these 4,200 laws. I wanted to say, this law is okay. This law has to go, food, or this law has to be changed. And if it has to be changed, I wanted to have a proposal of how to change it. Okay, so we understand what the objective is. 4,000 laws, and I want to end up with a pile of papers which says all the laws you have to eliminate, and then another pile of paper which are all the laws that have to be changed with a new writing. I'll explain why in a second that was the objective. And the objective is because I wanted to apply the principle of Marx. Principle of Marx, okay? And you may think I'm talking about Karl Marx, but you're wrong. It's not Karl Marx. Not Karl Marx. So you may, that's okay, so we cross out. So you may think I'm talking about Groucho Marx. I mean, here we have some age group that I think you know what I'm talking about, okay? Sometimes when I talk to very young people, much younger people, they don't know who Groucho Marx is, but I think here I can use it. Now, unfortunately, I'm not talking about Groucho Marx. So I'm talking about Daniel Marx. Who is Daniel Marx? He's a friend of mine, whose last name happens to be Marx, okay? So what is the principle of Marx? Well, in 2001, I was Secretary of Economic Policy, and Daniel Marx was the Secretary of Finance of Argentina. It was the final months of convertibility, so it was kind of a pretty rough period. And I remember that the finance minister that we worked for was someone that probably you've heard the name, Domingo Cavallo, a very famous finance minister in Argentina. So one afternoon we were discussing something, and we were discussing A or B. To be honest, I don't even remember what we were discussing, but I remember it was two things, A or B, A or B, A or B. And we discussed 6 hours, and after struggling and sweating and discussing, we decide that we're going to do A. Perfect, we go to sleep, A. Next morning, the minister signs B. So I go to Daniel Marx, and I say, Daniel, what happened? I mean, am I totally nuts? But didn't we decide yesterday we're going to do A? Yes, Federico, we decided yesterday to do A. But this morning, the lawyer advisor came to the minister, and he gave him the decree to sign, and the decree was B. So the minister signed B, because that was the paper that was put in front of him. And then I realized my most important lesson in politics for the younger people that are here is that in politics, the one who wins the debate is not the most intelligent guy, it's not the smoothest guy, it's not the cleverest guy, it's the guy who puts the paper on the table. And once you put the paper on the table, and listen, I'm sure there are a lot of business people here, and I'm sure in business it's the same. I mean, you can all have discussions about what to do. Well, the guy who brings the business plan and says, this is what we have to do, A, B, C, and D, that's it. You have 80%, 90% of the debate won, okay? And because I know in politics, everybody has great ideas, but nobody kind of moves the pencil, as we say in Spanish, and gets things done. My objective was to have the 2 piles of paper so that the next president of Argentina could implement the reforms as he get it. And I needed a paper that he could or she could sign. It's not enough to say, oh, I have all these great ideas. No, where's the paper to sign? That's the only thing I cared about. By the way, let me just move ahead a minute. These are the piles, okay? So I actually managed to get the piles, okay? So I'll tell you a minute, sorry. I'll tell you in a second about this, okay? So the principle of Marx. So here we are. We have 4,000 laws. We have to classify them in these 3 items. Well, we have to have an idea of what we want to do with these laws. What are the principles that we want to sustain in the way we're going to change the laws? It's not kind of a random exercise that I start changing letters just for the fun of it. So this slide shows a little bit what were the main driving intellectual or principles that we used in actually doing this exercise. So for example, I'm going to go to the first one in just a second, but for example, if you look at my second bullet here is we wanted to remove all the restrictions to competition that are built into the law. That's something which is pretty natural and pretty obvious to do, all the barriers to entry. We wanted to avoid all the transfers, all the, it's kind of the tax system is like a Gruyere. You have Gruyere cheese here, the Swiss produce good Gruyere Swiss. I mean, the Swiss produce good everything. So anyway, I'm sure you have good Gruyere cheese. It's full of holes, correct? Okay, so we had a tax system which was full of holes, with a subsidy here, tax exemption there. So the idea was to have a much more simplified system. Certainly, we were trying to get the government out of the out of the middle. So everything where we could kind of get the government out of the middle is also also a principle. There was an idea that I think it's an interesting idea, which is, you have areas where you need a regulator, because we're also not kind of dogmatic. I mean, we're kind of practical people. So you have a regulator. For example, you have a supervision of the financial sector, okay, or supervision of insurance or whatever, or capital markets. But I say, it's a problem that the supervisor is a monopolist. The supervisor has a monopoly of supervision. And when you are a monopoly of anything, you kind of tend to abuse of your market power. So why don't we try, in as much as where we can, to have, why don't we, because we trust individual people, correct? We have an underlying belief in freedom and the ability of every person to pursue its own happiness and take its own decisions. Maybe we should think, where we have a regulator, we have a segment which is a regulator, why don't we allow for a segment which is unregulated of the same thing? So you say, for example, I want to issue equity. I can have an equity issued with authorization, supervision of the Security and Exchange Commission. But if I want to issue an equity without that supervision, fine, do it. The only thing is you have to tell people this is a security issued without the supervision of the security. And if people choose to do that, fine, let them be free. Sting used to say, no, if you love someone, let them free. And but the interesting thing of that is if that would check the supervisor itself. Because now if the supervisor does a bad supervisory role, like, for example, imposing excessive costs, which don't have an equivalent gain in terms of solving whatever reason the supervisor exists for, then people will move to the unregulated market. So it forces some, and I have some wonderful examples that we've implemented this idea in Argentina. If we have time at the end or you're interested, I can go into it, okay? But let me just, of course, everything that increased transparency, you cannot imagine the amount of hidden privileges in the law. Sometimes you will read in the law 60 articles, and then Article 53, bomb. It had a bomb, which is a lot of money channeled. It's lost there in the middle of, that's why I wanted to read every law, because I didn't want to have anything kind of there. And one of the things that also was, before going to the first point, the other thing that I was, because when I started working this, I started working for one of the presidential candidates. I'll tell you the story about in just a minute. And this presidential candidate said, Federico, do this job and do it as if there were no political constraints. Forget about 100% about the political constraints, because the political constraints have to be put by the politicians, not by the technician. So if you yourself are kind of double guessing the political constraints, I'll never have this full scope of alternatives that I can choose from, and so do it without political constraint. Now, my first point is perhaps the most technical or the most academic, which is that, as an economist, we have a lot of, we discuss market, we understand the optimality of the market, the competitive market equilibrium. You mentioned Debreu, the welfare theorems and all the like, and we're 100% truly believers in the benefits of the market. Then you have market failures. So we discuss market failures, asymmetric information, moral hazard, externalities, you name it. Well, the point I want to make is the fact that you have a market failure is not a blank check for regulation. Because it happens to me in my conversations with the bureaucrats that say, oh, they throw asymmetric information, and then with that they think they have a license to kill, correct? That they have a license to do whatever regulation they want. And for example, the concept of asymmetric information, for those who are not here economists, let me just explain in a minute. It was put forward by an American economist called George Akerlof. He wrote a paper in the QJE in 1973, if I don't remember wrong, and he won the Nobel Prize for this prize. And a very simple idea. Imagine that you're selling a good, but the information you have about the good is different than the information the buyer has of the good. For example, the typical example that he used was used cars. When you're selling a used car, you know more about the car you're selling than the buyer knows about the car he's buying, if he or she decides to buy it. So you say, why is this guy selling the car? Because if the car is doing well, why would he want to sell it? So the fact that the car is on the market means that probably the car is defectuous or has a problem, or at least is more likely to be defectuous and have a problem. So the amount of money I'm willing to pay for the car is lower because I don't know about the car, so my expectations bring. Now, as the price that I'm willing to pay for the car falls, the people who have cars which are good ones, they say it's not worth for me selling it at this price, so I keep the car. So that means that the pool of cars that remain in the market become of lower and lower quality. But people anticipate that the cars are of lower and lower quality, so they're willing to pay less and less for the cars. You see the dynamics, the market disappears. So in order to, that's a problem of asymmetric information, and that's the problems asymmetric information can create in a market. Well, surprisingly, the market for used cars, which was the example that Arkerov used in his Nobel-winning article, in the US, is not a regulated market. What does that mean? That means that the market finds ways of solving the asymmetric problems. You buy it into a dealer, you know where the dealer lives, the dealer gives you a guarantee. There are people that you can hire so that they can check your car. A number of things the market can make up to solve. So the fact that there was asymmetric information is not all in itself a justification for having regulation. We have in Argentina, so that's the first point I want to make. You have to make a much stronger case to regulate a market, even in the presence of market distortion or market failures. The second thing is that you want to be aware that regulation typically are not the result of a benevolent central planner, well-intentioned politician trying to figure out what has to be regulated. Many times the regulation is the result of someone who lobbied or corrupted the politician to get a regulation in its favor. Let me just give you an example. When Milei came to government, the provision of satellite internet in Argentina was forbidden. And you say, why on earth would you forbid the satellite internet? What's the idea that you can have that forces you to forbid that? Well, the truth of the matter, imagine Argentina is a very wide country, very thinly populated, so it's very difficult to get a cable infrastructure to everybody. Maybe you have someone which is 500 kilometers away and it's just an outpost in a rural area. So it's ideal for satellite internet, but it was forbidden. Well, the largest media conglomerate in Argentina is the biggest internet provider, so they had convinced the government to forbid the satellite internet so not to have competition. And look at how crooked things were that the previous government had spent $7 billion trying to lay out fiber optics in Argentina, fiber optic cable, fiber cable. $7 billion. Well, of course, impossible to get internet to everybody in such a large country and spending that amount of money. So what did Javier Milei did? He got a piece of paper and he wrote that everybody can offer satellite internet. The next day, Starlink was offering satellite internet in Argentina. Today, 250,000 Argentine families have satellite internet. Any place that you are in Argentina, however isolated you are, you have access to satellite internet. How much money did the government spend providing satellite internet? Zero. Okay, so careful with the regulation because, of course, I'm sure that in Switzerland, you guys got your act together, but in Latin America and many other cases, regulation is not a good. Regulation is a bad. Okay, that's what makes my job so rewarding. Okay, to get rid of all these things. Okay, and then the other thing is this comes from our military dictatorships. For example, the military, the military want to control everything. We have a military. For example, you don't have military. You yourself as citizens are the military. Even in that, you guys are great. But we have a military. So the military, they like order. So, for example, the Constitution says you can do any business that you want. Our Constitution is a constitution built on the basis of the American Constitution. It's a great constitution, freedom of trade. Okay, so now comes the regulator, and the regulator says, oh yes, the Constitution says you can do it, but no, it's forbidden. This thing is forbidden. Unless you register. The government is going to set up a registry. If you register, then you can do this thing that the Constitution already allowed you to do. Okay, 7 p.m. And then, of course, you have to put a government agency controlling the registry, and you have to put all the sanctions for the people who not comply with the registry, and you have to put the police of the registry and all this. Excuse me my French, all this bullshit, okay? And, okay, these are the kind of things we want to get rid of completely, altogether. Okay, so those are the basic principles. Now, so now we have the principles, we have the 4,000 laws, so we're looking at the 4,000 laws, we have the principles. Okay, let's get to work. So the first thing I did is I put a team of people. So I was a professor at the Universidad de San Andrés, so my team was the following: 4 law students, very bright, a constitutional law professor, because, sorry, I have to say, my budget was 0, okay? 0. So the number 0. And so 4 law students, a constitutional law professor, great guy from the Universidad de San Andrés, and my assistant in my Principle of Economics course, which today is the chainsaw man in the government, okay? And we started reading. You have to start with something which is called the Law Digest. I don't know what the name is in Swiss, but every country has this. It's a compendium of the laws that are current, because you know that some laws kind of repeal previous laws, so you have to keep track of which are the laws that are current. So with that we had in Argentina, so our 4,000 laws were the 4,000 laws that were in the digest. So, okay, I put this small group of people. But then the interesting part is when we got to some laws that we didn't know anything about and we had to ask for help. Okay? So who do you ask for help? So the first thing that you think is, I'm going to ask for help to someone who knows about the issue. Kind of seems like a reasonable thing to think, okay? No, doesn't work. Because the person who's embedded in this system is so accustomed to this system that the person is not radical enough. Because maybe we have to get rid of everything, but if the person has already made up its profession, so this person is going to simplify on the edges and improve things on the edges, but it didn't have the radicality that we needed. Because our job was not to simplify laws. Our role was to question whether the law should exist or not. So we ask a much more profound, because remember, I told you, a lot of the laws were not the result of benevolent players, but were the result of lobby. So I have to be very critical of the laws, and I start there. So you could say, well, maybe I should not hire. I couldn't hire, I have money, but maybe I could ask the help of a big law studio. Total disaster, completely useless. They would give me back something which was 10 more times more complicated, okay? Because of course, what they sell is basically dodging the system and dealing with the system, so useless. So who were the people that ended up helping me? What I call the victims. You know, the lawyer which is struggling with all this crazy thing, the small entrepreneurs which knows all the terrible thing that the government does to them. Those were the people that ended up being helpful in the sense that they would deliver a material and a product which was more useful for me, okay? So the first exercise that we did with the team was to weed out all the laws that we thought that had to go, which is kind of in or out, correct? So that was kind of, we could do that exercise, but then when we had to modify certain laws on issues that we didn't know so much about, we had to do something else. And here's, I think, where is the key of the methodology that I devised, which is the following. Let's imagine environmental laws. I don't know nothing about environmental. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not that interested in the issue. So I say, who can give me a hand? I ask around and say, who can give me a hand with our environmental law? So they say, okay, such a person. Okay, Christopher can give me, okay, Christopher will give you a hand with that. So I call Christopher and say, Christopher, can you give me a hand with the environmental laws? Says, Christopher, oh yes, I work on environmental laws, I have a lot of things, I'm going to send you a paper with what I think has to be done with environmental laws. I said, look, if you want, send me the paper, but I'm telling you, I'm not reading it. He says, oh, you don't read it? What do you mean you're not reading? No, I'm not reading. I'm not interested in diagnosis. I mean, we're over-diagnosticated, okay? So we don't need diagnostics, we need solutions. And, well, we can do a meeting, and then I can explain, no, sorry, I don't do meetings. Oh, you don't do meetings? You don't want a paper, you don't meet it. What do you want? I can send you some bullets with the main points. I don't read bullets. Okay? You don't read bullets either. So what do you want? I say, I don't know, tell me what, remember, what am I looking? I have to get a pile of paper. What do I need? The Marx principle. I need a pile of laws that the president can sign, correct? I don't need a diagnosis. What does the president do with the diagnosis? He can light the asado, the fire for the asado, but nothing else with a diagnosis, okay? I need that thing to sign. So the guy says, what is the, well, I say, what's the problem with the environmental law? We have a problem with the glaciers. Okay, what is the problem with the glaciers? We have a law which forbids economic activity on a glacier, which, relax, it's okay, no, we're not planning to touch that. But the problem with the law is that there's an area surrounding the glaciers, which is called a periglacial zone, where also economic activity is forbidden, and that area is very poorly defined. So you can have a whole province, maybe, which you cannot do any mining because of this law, correct? So we need to define better the periglacial area. Okay, what's that? That's Article 6 of the law. Perfect. It's item C of Article 6 of the law. Okay, so download the law, put it in a Word file, press track changes, and you write the changes that need to be done in the law. And then you send that to me. That's the only thing I'm going to take as a product. That's the only thing I need, by the way. Now, in the conversation, when I got to that point, 70% of the people disappeared. Maybe because they were scared about touching the law. I had been in Congress, so I was not scared. Maybe people were just, everybody's great, having the great ideas, but then when you have to kind of see how it's done, the devil is in the details, they were not up to the task. Or maybe there were people who were very good, and they say, I'm happy to give you an hour of my time so I can tell you what the problems are, but I'm not willing to work 2 months for you for free, and that's totally fair. I mean, I was not paying anything, so I cannot say anything. But the important thing for me is it allowed me to identify the people who were going to get me the job done from those that were not going to get me the job done without myself spending too much time in the process. Because so far, the only thing I've done is have a conversation of 5 minutes on the phone, and then he's not willing to. So a lot of people came to say, I want to help. So I said, okay, what is your topic? Beef production, perfect. Take law 24076 and 23113. Edit them to me and send them back. Never heard back from them, okay? But from the people that I did hear back, and then I liked what they did, then I said, oh, you did beef, why don't you do the milk, and etc. Okay, you see that point? Okay. So with this, I managed to get people who were willing to help, which were this kind of the victims of the system, and we started producing, and we ended up producing this. So this is on the left-hand side is the pile of, these are in my office, by the way. So this is the pile of laws that have to be repealed, and the one on the right is the modifications to the laws that we thought had to be modified, okay? So remember, I told you I was working this for Patricia Bullrich, who's one of the presidential candidates. She loses in the first round to Javier Milei. Javier Milei and another Peronist candidate go to the ballotage, and the day after the election, where Patricia loses, Patricia currently is the Minister of Security of Milei because she endorsed Milei, and she was very instrumental and helpful for Milei to be elected, that she, as the third contender in the race, supported Javier Milei. But she sends me an email and says, Federico, don't get discouraged, but the project that we had done, which was these two piles, will see the light with Javier even better than if I would have been elected. Because in our party, the status quo was already penetrating us, and this is the reason people didn't vote for us. And they voted for Javier because they wanted this radical change. So I think that is amazing. So, okay, so that's it. That's the story. This is it. I have the product. Because the other thing that I want to mention is that when you want to do radical reform, you also have to use the surprise factor. Because you're going against a lot of interest. So I call this the David versus Goliath strategy. Because you know the story, the biblical story, David versus Goliath. So David was kind of no match to the strength of this warrior he was facing. And so what did he do? He took some distance and he threw a stone to the head, with what do you call that? It's, I don't know. I'm sure the Swiss have very good instrument of stone throwing. And I'm the Appen sellers for sure. Okay, so why do I say it's a surprise factor? Because if this great warrior would have thought that a stone would have been thrown, probably he would have worn a helmet. Okay? So if he didn't, it's because he was not expecting it. So I think it's kind of the initial push is what is going to allow you to break the resistance of the status quo. So this is why, for me, it was so important that the president that took office in December of 23 had what had to be signed to change. Okay, so job done. The work is done. Here are the two piles. And then, of course, you start a different strategy, which is implementation. This is the preparation. This is the work, no? And implementation starts combining one legal strategy. What do we do with this? We send it to Congress to get it passed. It's every country here starts having their own way and their own institutional setup. And for example, Argentina has something called emergency decrees. Under exceptional circumstances, the president can issue legislation. When Javier Milei got to power, I told you at the beginning, inflation was running at 1.5% per day. So I think we can consider that pretty much an exceptional situation and a pretty dramatic situation. And so on the 10th day in office, Javier issues an executive decree where we do a swipe in the regulation of the economy, which takes a lot of the material from these piles. And of course, it was a collective work that we did with the rest of the ministers, but it had a very strong input from these two piles. So we eliminated dozens of laws. We changed from the civil code to the air code to the customs code, the financial sector, you name it. Okay, we did a tremendous amount of things. And then 10 days later, and it was kind of that was the stone, correct? The stone of David. And laws that had been discussed in Argentina for ages, for example, the generic use in the prescriptions for medicine, which the labs had resisted in Argentina for many times. Well, boom, kind of it went in there, all of it, all in. And then 10 days later, we sent a big bill to Congress, which is called the Basis Law, that Congress discussed for 7 months. It was the law which was it was so large and it had so many themes and so many different things that Congress debated that law for 7 months, and then we finally got it approved on July 8th of 2024. And I think that those two pieces of legislation, plus the fact that the finance minister, Luis Caputo, achieved a fiscal surplus in the first month, plus something that I don't have time to get into, which is that we basically pacified the streets of Argentina from social protest and everything, were kind of 4 initial hits, fantastic hits of the Milei administration, which basically kind of set the tone for what he was, for the rest of, for what has been his presidency so far. So here I have it, that you have the executive decree, was 7023, the basis law. And this, what you have here is a graph of the number of deregulations that we have implemented, or that I keep implementing, or that we keep implementing as a government. That here a regulation is an article in a law or in a norm which eliminates an obligation on behalf of the private sector as per to the state. Okay, so it's you had to do something, now you don't have to do it anymore. You have a registry, you don't have to do it anymore. You had a restriction, you don't have it anymore. Okay, so we're kind of 9,000 deregulations and counting. Okay. One thing now, so now we're talking, we're in the phase of execution. So of course, because people say, how do you continue doing this? And we have 700,000 decrees. We have I said you have 4,000 laws. We have 700,000 decrees. So how do you, it's kind of the Library of Babel. I mean, it's kind of impossible there. So So basically what I did is I opened up my email and I told people, write to me, come to me and tell me how the government is making our life miserable. Help me help you. Try to tell me what is the regulations that is bothering you. So people flooded my email. Some stories are amazing. So there's one that I typically tell because it really kind of depicts the whole story. I have a guy, he writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with my watermelons? I said, what's the problem with your watermelons? They don't taste good. So no, they taste great. In fact, I'm a great exporter of watermelons. So what's your problem? Well, the problem is the Food and Drug Administration asked me to package the watermelons in a specific way. And I export the watermelons, and the watermelons, my client abroad, they don't want that package, they want another package. So I go to the government and say, allow me to package the watermelons the way I want the watermelons to be packaged. Not me, my client. At the end of the day, we're not talking plutonium here, okay? It's not enriched uranium. It's a bloody watermelon, okay? So who cares how it's packaged? And government says, Federico, I've been kind of going over in the office, and the government, no, here's the regulation. It says it has to be packaged that way. So can you give me a help with this? I'm kind of crying. I'm reading this on my computer, and I'm crying, yeah? And then he says, but I found a solution for this, which is that I package the watermelons the way the government tells me to package the watermelons. And then when the boat leaves, after 100 meters, the boats stop. And then I send 70 guys on the boat, and they tear the packages, and then they repackage, okay? And so I'm reading this, and I tell to my staff, I said, look what I'm reading, and I read it, and I said, it has to be true. Because if this guy was kind of teasing me and making up the story, he could never have thought about the story, okay? This has to be, reality surpasses fiction. I mean, this can only be true if it's real. And so I started investigating, and really I realized that what this person was telling me was the tip of the iceberg of regulation of the fruit industry, which is as ridiculous as basically measuring the size of the faucet in the restrooms of the fruit plant producers. Okay, so we got rid of all of that. And the other last thing that I want to mention as indication for me is price differentials. So if I see in Argentina something to be much more expensive than in the rest of the world, then that kind of gives me a hint that I have a problem there in terms of the supply, and then I can focus on that as well. So that's another. Let me just, I was going to talk a little bit about, sorry, I get confused here. I'll talk a little bit about resistance, but I'm just going to the bureaucracy kind of puts a lot of resistance to this reform program. The interests that are affected by the deregulation may be a source of problem. I'll explain, that's the only thing I'm going to explain in this slide, which is why this has not been a problem for me. And then, of course, there's ideology. I mean, people just maybe think differently. Maybe they honestly think that things should be regulated or not. But let me just focus here only, because I'm running out of time, on the second point, which is the interest. And I have the most powerful weapon to keep the interest, because I'm deregulating something which is going to affect the privilege of someone, of course, in benefit of the population. But you can imagine that interest is going to fight tooth and nail to avoid the deregulation. So I have a weapon which is impossible to surpass, which is Twitter. Elon Musk, Twitter, X. So how does this work? So imagine that I'm here doing a conference and say, I'm going to deregulate such an industry. Say, the irony, I'm making it up, okay, the poultry industry. And then there are large poultry producers, so it's in the newspapers. Sturzenegger is going to deregulate the poultry industry. Immediately, as soon as the news is up, the president is retweeting the news. So the president is basically saying, I'm endorsing this deregulation. So the guy who's going to fight, try to contain, says, what are we going to do? If already the president, the number one, has basically publicly stated that he agrees with the deregulation. And so I tell the president that, Javier Milei is it's an extraordinary person. First of all, because he gave us a lot of freedom to work. He trusts us. He gives us support, permanent support. Of course, he has made it extremely clear what he wants his government to be about, which are these two ideas of reducing government expenditure to have a surplus and economic freedom. So no one in the government has any doubt of what this government is about. He's produced a small team. We are only 9 ministers. We think pretty much alike. We believe in the ideas of freedom. We believe in the ideas of a small government. We believe in the ideas of fiscal prudency and having a surplus and on deregulation. So I say to Javier, maybe you do these tweets because you're just kind and because you support us, because you believe in what we're doing, but you're not aware that by you doing that, you help me do my job. It's a little bit like I say, it's like you're walking ahead of me, clearing my path. Because the fact that you're endorsing what we're doing allows me to move ahead, but not because I can move ahead, because you're allowing me to move ahead. So the unwavering support of the president for this agenda, which is his agenda, so it makes sense, but you have to have the bravery, you have to have the commitment, you have to have the attention to do it, is what actually allows us to surpass the obstacles that I may face on this dimension. And just to closing up, because I think probably, Christopher, I have to finish, correct? I have to finish. My rule of thumb is that whenever I deregulate, the prices tumble around between 30 and 40%. So here I give you a couple of examples. For example, what I have up there is in the Executive Decree 7023, we eliminated rent control, a catastrophe that we had in the country. The supply of apartments for lease had basically fallen to zero. We eliminated all restrictions. You can do the contract whatever way, for the length you want, in the currency you want, you can do whatever you want. The offer of rentals skyrocketed, increased 300%, the price of rentals for 30%. Tremendous success, immediate success. What do I have? I have the price of medicines, the price of iron, the price of yerba mate. Do you know yerba mate? Have you heard yerba mate? Yerba mate? You know Lionel Messi, correct? You know, everybody knows Lionel Messi. He's always with the mate. He's with the mate. And so mate is an interesting example, mate, because a wonderful story, because mate is like an infusion, like a tea. It's very good. I recommend that you try it. And we had hundreds of producers, hundreds of brands, very competitive environment for production, large firms, small firms. So what does the government do when you have a competitive industry? The government, it transforms it into a monopoly. You know, we have an antitrust department which tries to transform the monopolies into competition. No, here in Argentina, the government, if you have competition, you transform it into a monopoly. How do you transform it? You create an Instituto Nacional de la Yerba Mate, the National Institute of the Yerba Mate. And what do the guys do? So all the producers, let's get together and let's agree on the price and let's increase the price 50%. Which brings us to a very famous economist who's called Mancur Olson, who wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action. And Mancur also used to say that the biggest challenge in policy is that sometimes when you have these policies, the beneficiaries are concentrated. And the ones who pay the cost are very diluted over the whole population. So you have 47 million people paying more for the yerba mate. The yerba mate is not the most important item in their budget, so maybe they will not mobilize or they will not kind of coalesce in their collective action to have this price not increase, but the producers have much more at stake, so they are much more effective in generating this collective action which generates and persists in this price. So in the Executive Decree 7023, we eliminated the ability of the Institute to set prices. The price fell 40%, and it was pretty rough for some time. And I used to tell the producers, look, I mean, your business cannot be charging the Argentine consumer, Argentine families 50% more what this product is worth. And it's a very successful industry. It sells this product to 96% of Argentinian families. So I said, to how many families in the other country did you sell this product to? I mean, if you can introduce this product in 96% of the families of Argentina, why wouldn't you be able to introduce it in 15% of the families in Swiss? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense, except that you have it easy here with this protection, so you never kind of took the trouble and the bother to go to the Swiss market to sell the yerba mate. And it's a story with a happy ending, because even though the initial months were difficult, today the exports of yerba mate in Argentina are a record. And exports are booming. So it was a question of kind of generating this click, and I think that's a wonderful story. And then here you have in the other graph, you have electronic clothes and everything. Let me just finish that with there. I'm just going to say, let me see what I put here. I think Javier Milei has defied a little bit what is possible or impossible. I think it's an interesting story for the world to watch. Has balanced the budget in a month, has pushed for deregulation, and we are totally convinced that this is the path for Argentina, the path of economic freedom, that people left allowed to be free are in the market to serve, not to cheat. And that the Argentines have a tremendous potential, and what they were lacking was freedom. So this is it. And I go back to the beginning of my presentation when I told you about 2 million people that had left Argentina. And I have a son which is 20 years old. I have a son which is 19 years old. I have a daughter which is 15 years old. There's a movie that I don't know if you saw it or not, which is called Voyage to the Center of the Earth. It's a Hollywood movie. So the argument of this movie is that suddenly the core of the world stops spinning, and okay, so the world is about to collapse as a place where you could live. So they have to do an expedition to the center of the Earth and blow a couple of atomic bombs so that the core starts spinning. Have you seen the movie? Someone has seen? A couple of people have seen the movie. I don't know how big on Hollywood you guys are here in Switzerland, but anyway. So they go into the Earth. Also, the scientists are talking among themselves, and then one says, "Oh, what a big burden we have on our shoulders, that if we fail, we're here to save the world." And there's a French scientist, a very cool French scientist, that says, the world. Who cares about the world? I'm not here to save the world. And everybody looks at him and says, what are we doing here? I'm here to save my wife and my daughter. I'm here to save my family. And I think all of us who are involved in this challenge to return Argentina to prosperity and give freedom to the Argentines is because we want to grow with our children near. And so wish us luck, wish us persistence, wish us courage, and we hope that in the future we'll make Argentina great again. Thank you.